everyone to the first webinar of our Global Christianity series. We're so glad to see people here from all over the world today, which is really the point of this series. We want to gather Christians from all over who are excited to learn about Christianity on a global level. These webinars align with our new Master of Arts in Global Christianity program, which is designed for students who are passionate about understanding the complexities of the Christian faith around the world. Students are educated in biblical, theological, and ministry studies taught by faculty who live, work, and worship in various cultural contexts around the globe. Whether aspiring to work in academia, cross-cultural ministry, nonprofit organizations, or international development, the Master of Arts in Global Christianity empowers students to be thoughtful, informed, and effective Christian leaders in multicultural or cross-cultural settings. Our MA in Global Christianity is online and asynchronous in order to be accessible to students everywhere, regardless of time zone. You can find more information about this degree on our website. As part of this program, today's speaker, Dr. David Tarus, teaches a course, A Theology of the Person, an African Perspective. If you have questions for Dr. Tarus, please feel free to put them in the chat during the presentation, and there will be a brief Q&A at the end as time allows. Dr. Tarus is a graduate of our PhD program, we are very proud to say. He is the Executive Director of the Association for Christian Theological Education in Africa and an adjunct professor of global Christianity here at McMaster Divinity College. And we are so delighted, Dr. Tarus, to welcome you today for this session. Thank you.
All right, it's good to see all of us here today. Thank you so much. So as Sarah has introduced me, my name is David. So I'm truly privileged to do this today. We talk about Imago Dei in light of disability in Africa. Just give me a minute. So this is actually based on a book that has just come out, produced by Langham. And we have Professor Liz Mburu, who is going to share briefly about Langham Ministry towards the end of our session tonight or this morning. So my chapter is titled Being Different, Imago Dei in Light of Disability in Africa. And I focus on societal stigma and harmful theologies that marginalize individuals with disabilities and argue for a more inclusive interpretation of the image of God. And of course, I try to also reflect on the role of the church in creating opportunities and creating systems and infrastructure that honors the contribution and honors the people that live with disabilities in Africa. People with disabilities are often marginalized. And I think this is, of course, not an African problem. I think it's a global problem. You know, we have theological views that tend to diminish the humanity of people living with disabilities. In Africa, of course, we wrestle over issues to do with how we perceive sin. You know, we see sin, of course, we see disability as a result of sin committed by a person, either by the person or by his or her ancestors or his parents. And sometimes you have the perception that a person living with disability lacks faith, you know, so you have all these miracles or prayers of healing that is often performed in churches or in public spaces. You know, we have these very popular events called the Crusades. And then, of course, this is not talking about the Crusades in church history, but these are open air meetings that tends to have prayer sessions for praying for people living with disabilities. You have sometimes people casting out demons, trying to exorcise demons and try to deliver and pray for people living with disabilities. We have always had of forced sterilization, we have abortion, we have abuse, even killing of children born with disabilities. You have children who are chained. They don't go to school. They're hidden from the public. And also we have churches that don't have room for children in their Sunday school programs. And I think actually most churches will not have um, programs for either adults or children living with disabilities. My wife has been part of a special needs ministry in our church, and she learned sign language on YouTube, and she's really been helping the church to create infrastructure and to support people living with disabilities and so on and so forth. So I think this is really important for us to talk about. Just this morning, I was trying to search for some of the documents from the Human Rights Watch, especially concerning how people living with disabilities are treated. And I found this interesting study on shackles, children who've been chained. And this is actually not a child, this is an adult who has been chained in a church somewhere in Western Kenya. And we have such kind of stories, this person saying I've been chained for 5 years. The chain is so heavy, it doesn't feel right. It makes me sad. I stay in a small room with 7 men. I'm not allowed to wear clothes, only underwear. I have to go to the toilet in a bucket. I eat porridge in the morning, and if I'm lucky, I find bread at night, but not every night. It's not how a human being is supposed to be. A human being is supposed to be free, and absolutely true. That is how a human being is supposed to be. Yesterday, I saw this being shared, doing rounds on some social media in Kenya. This gentleman from my hometown is saying I'm almost getting depressed. And he has written to some, what you see there, CS and CS, those are cabinet secretaries, members of parliament and cabinet secretaries, naming them and trying to beg them for a job. And this is what I say in a section of the book. The church and society often do not value people with disabilities as employable individuals because they have embraced the capitalist notion of productivity. Such a notion esteems people only if they are competent and capable of creating wealth. Society does not value debility, brokenness, and vulnerability. They would rather employ someone who would work faster, make money more rapidly, think more quickly, talk more swiftly, and present an appealing image of the organization. So that is what we are dealing with. And we need to be able to counter this with a better narrative, a better way of life. And that, I think, is the doctrine of the image of God provides a very good way for us to be able to counter such kind of ways of life. So the image of God in the Bible. So the doctrine of the image of God rests upon ample scriptural warrant and accordingly forms the centerpiece of a proper view of all members of humanity. What that means is that we actually do not have a lot of scripture passages in scripture in the Bible that talks about the doctrine of the image of God. Actually, in the Old Testament, we have I think only 3 specific mentioned of this very important doctrine. Genesis 1:26 to 27, Genesis 5:1, and Genesis 9:6. Psalm 8, verse 4 to 6 alludes to the image of God by celebrating humanity's place in creation. And then we have a couple of passages in the New Testament that specifically talks about the Imago Dei, either in terms of our creation in the image of God or our recreation in the image of Christ, being sanctified in Christ because of our fall. So I'm going to talk about 3 specific perspectives of the image of God. The first one, which I think those who have studied biblical theology or church history, you will realize that we have 3 specific mentions. So perhaps we could have more than 3, but 3 are dominant. And the first one is what is called the structuralist or substantialist view of the Imago Dei. And so this view looks at something within the substantial form of human nature. It identifies something that we have as human beings and perceives that to be that which constitutes the Imago Dei. David Kane says that throughout church history or Christian writers up to Aquinas, we find the image of God conceived as man's power to reason. So our cognitive abilities, our reasoning has been identified as that which is distinctive and that which identifies us as image of God. And of course, there have been other substances that have been elevated, and that includes conscience, emotional capacity, spiritual awareness, immortality, freedom, moral capacity. Those have been identified as what it means to be created in the image of God. As far as discussions on disability is concerned, I would say that this specific identification of the Imago Dei has a couple of weaknesses. And the first one, of course, is that Scripture does not limit the image of God to cognitive substances. There is nowhere in the Bible that identifies reason as definitive of what it means to be created in the image of God. But also, I think more importantly, limiting Imago Dei to cognition or to reasoning diminishes the value of the physical body. And I think this has been a major problem in Christian history for a long time. And we have had people writing about Gnosticism and some of the philosophical persuasions that seem to diminish the value of the human body. And we see that Jesus Christ showed us, he embodied for us, or he showed for us the beauty and even though the body, as we see in Jesus, was weak and broken and beaten, and Jesus Christ dying and resurrected in a scarred body, but yet even in that brokenness, in that state, Jesus affirmed the beauty of the body. But I think another weakness, of course, is that it tends to diminish the value or the sanctity of those that might not be perceived or seen to be imperfect, to have that particular substance that has been identified in perfection. So you have people, for example, who live with mental brokenness. Some people like my grandmother, and talk about my grandmother in the chapter, in the book, who lived with a mental condition that she acquired when my father was a teenager. She got cerebral malaria, and my grandmother lived with that condition until she passed away in 1995. And so, but the church didn't know what to do with my grandmother. The community didn't know what to do with her. And we have, of course, so many people that might not possess that particular substance to the degree that we perceive. And they could be treated or mistreated because they might not be viewed as perfectly in image of God. And of course, we have seen this happening in Nazi regime where people living with disabilities were killed. And of course, we have a very recent example in Uganda with a dictator called Idi Amin Dada that were told, collected or went around villages herding people that were living with disabilities and putting them in huge trucks and dumping them in places, and they were killed. And that I think would be a big problem, that those who advocate for this specific view, and I think there's been quite a good publication that addressed this. The second view is what is called the royal functional view of the image of God, which, of course, looks at human beings as God's representatives or agents or viceroys or ambassadors granted authorized power to share in God's rule or administration of the earth's resources and creatures. So this particular view goes back to the ancient Near East cultures and tries to dig into what perhaps the readers of Genesis would understand the writer to be communicating. So they look at the story, the ancient Near East cultures. They try to understand what they would look at the context and try to imagine what the readers of Genesis would think the Imago Dei to be. So they say, and this Richard Middleton has done a tremendous work here on this particular view, that the ancient Sumerian or Babylonian or Egyptian texts look at kings as being shaped in the image of the gods. And Klaus Westermann says the background of Genesis 1:26 is what Egypt and Mesopotamia say about the king as the image of God. A person as the image of God corresponds to the king as the image of God. Both are God's viceroy or representatives. Now, so following this line of thought, the image bearers, in this case, powerful kings and priests, were significant representative of a divine being. Their lives were a living expression of the gods. The unique thing about this with Genesis is that Genesis expands image bearing beyond a select individuals or beyond the kings to everybody, saying that all human beings are created in the image and likeness of God. Now, so this, of course, one weakness that I see in this, an exclusive emphasis. If you look at dominion or rulership or creation care as, and you limit it, or you look at it and say, well, that is the only way we image God, then what about those human beings who might not be perceived to, to rule, to exercise rule? So they might also be prone to abuse or diminished perception of their lives. So, but then those who advocate for this view respond by saying, well, stewardship is an outcome of being in God's image. It is not the actual image of God itself. So there is a greater focus on corporate responsibility. People with disabilities join their fellow human beings in a communion of responsible citizens. All human beings together become stewards of God's creation. So it is not as a few individuals, not kings, not rulers, not select individuals, but we together become stewards of God's creation. So in this regard, no one is excluded from stewardship. No one is excluded from the image of God. So this language of communion leads us to the third view, which is the relational view of the Imago Dei. So human beings bear God's image in an active sense through different relationships. So human beings together are God's image bearers. Now, so this leads us now to really something exciting about the African contribution to all this conversation. And this, if you are not familiar with the language of Ubuntu, I welcome you to check it out. It is really, there's quite a good number of scholarships that have come out talking about Ubuntu. And Ubuntu is a language of humanity being inextricably linked together. So human beings together, the language of communion. And Bishop Desmond Tutu is well known for advocating or talking about this. This is an awesome book called No Future Without Forgiveness. It's actually a biography or a story of the Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa following the apartheid regime. And Desmond Tutu served as the chair of the commission. This is what he says. Ubuntu is very difficult to render into a Western language. It speaks of the very essence of being human. So when we want to give high praise to someone, we say, you Ubuntu. Hey, so and so has Ubuntu. And what that means is that you are generous, you're hospitable, you're friendly, you're caring, you're compassionate, you share what you have. It is to say my humanity is caught up, is inextricably bound up in yours. We belong in a bundle of life. We say a person is a person through other persons. It is not, I think, therefore I am. It says rather, I am human because I belong, I participate, I share. In other words, to be human or to bear the image of God, to use the language of Genesis, is to be humane, to be generous, to live out what it means to be human. In my language, I come from a western part of Kenya, people call Kalenjin, the Kalenjin people. We have a saying or a proverb that says, Machi chi negero kochi amachi. A person is not a person who does not act like a person. A person is not a person who does not act human. So to be human is to act humane, to live in community with others. Other conversations around anthropology from Africa looks at the primacy of religion, that we are all connected as worshippers, as beings that worship. Of course, this is not new to Africa. It is not unique to Africa. We are all worshiping beings. And Professor J.K.A. Smith from Calvin University, in his Cultural Liturgy series, has talked about that human beings are liturgical animals. We are beings of liturgy. We worship. We are worshiping beings. One professor from Kenya called John Beatty as saying that Africans are notoriously religious. So using the same language, you can actually argue that we are all religious. All human beings are liturgical beings. So we are all interconnected in these different levels of relationships. Relationship with God, relationship with one another, relationship with the non-material world, with the world around us, the trees, the mountains, the rivers, everything around us. So we relate with God. All these different levels of relationships defines who we are. Now, as I have mentioned, Ubuntu is human. I like this book, Imaging God, Dominion and Stewardship by Douglas John Hall. He says we are creatures whose being implies relatedness. The solitary, isolated, self-sufficient human being, the self-made man that still exists for us as a rhetorical ideal, is in fact a contradiction in terms. To be in the world is to be with. And this, of course, is not an African writing. This is actually, I believe, an American, talking about for him, what does it mean to be human? And he's talking about the doctrine of the Imago Dei. And he says to be in the world is to be with. So we cannot be pulled out of relationships. We are at our core, human beings that live in relationship. Well, I'm very sure those who are familiar with, some conversations around theological anthropology would know John Zulus. He says, well, even though what John Hall talks about, that to live is to be in community, he says that, well, one reality in the Western world is that there is a lot of individualism. You see, since the days of the French philosopher J.B. Sartre, Western culture seems to subscribe to this view in many ways. Individualism is present in the very foundation of the Western culture. That I think is something that is quite acknowledged by all of us, that whereas the other parts of the world, the global South, Africa, Asia, Latin America, tends to focus on communion, tends to focus on community and relationships. The Western world tends to focus on tends to focus on individualism more than community. Well, let me say that African communality alone is not sufficient for a correct theological anthropology. that esteems people living with disabilities. A Christocentric anthropology is necessary, and that is an anthropology that is centered on Christ. This is what I talk about in the section of this specific book that I really encourage all of us to get. So Jesus, the Christ, shows people how to live differently because he's the true humanity. That is a quotation coming from different authors. Those what you see there. The true humanity, the perfect realization of true humanity and what human nature is intended to be. Jesus is the embodiment, the archetype, the definition of what it means to be human. He is the image of God par excellence and the telos, or the goal of human existence. He exemplifies what humans are called to be and destined to be. He represents a life of complete obedience to God's will on earth. He shows life in its fullness. So what I'm trying to say is that, well, we can have these different presentations coming from different cultures, including the African culture. The focus on Ubuntu, the focus on community, the focus on relationships, the focus on hospitality and care for one another and so on. But that alone, or those things alone, are not enough because, well, we still see tribalism or ethnocentrism. We see violence around us. We see, the damaging effects of the fall of human beings and the reality that the image of God, though it was not erased by sin, it was defaced. It was marred by sin. We see the reality of that everywhere around us. And even in how we treat people that are different, people that look different or talk different or, think differently from us. What we need is the way of Christ. We need Jesus Christ. We need to be aligned to Jesus and surrendering our lives to Jesus' role through the Spirit so that we are formed as image of God, as formed as people that will live life as God intended. And this is what, again, I say. Jesus is more than an example. He is the enabler of an alternative existence. Jesus' very presence in the world aided us out of sin that had disabled our relationship with God. He lived among those that are often considered broken and disabled. He lifted them up when others passed by. He touched the untouchables. He washed feet and fed the hungry. He broke bread with the rejected, sick, and frail members of the society. He went beyond identifying with the disenfranchised members of the society. He was himself disenfranchised and abandoned. He allowed his body to be broken and crushed for our sake. His broken body is life-giving, for it was his broken body that helped us overcome the disability of sin, and through the process of sanctification, purifies us to live as God's image bearers, reflecting God's glory on earth. He did all this not only to save individuals, but also communities. And so that, I think, is what I see as the contribution of Christ to a formation or a reformation, to use James K. Smith's language, a calibration or a reordering of our lives as people created in God's image. Because I really value that language by that professor from Calvin. He talks about the distorting power of culture and the things around us, that we have been deformed or misshaped by the systems of values around us, the cultural values and the way we've been schooled or catechized by the system around us, so that we are no longer reflecting the image of God as God intended. But what Christ does is to reform us, reshape us, recalibrate us, enabling us to be the humanity in God's image. So I think what this means is that, well, we are not really going to be seeking what does it really mean to image God in the sense of either possessing something or doing certain things, but looking at what is God forming us to be, what is God shaping us to be as human beings. As I conclude, I will want to talk about the ecclesial implications of the doctrine of the image of God. And I see three ecclesial implications, or the implications of the image of God on the church, and how the church is supposed to live out or to practice an ethic that is informed and shaped by the doctrine of the image of God in how they treat people, or how we treat people living with disabilities. The first one is, of course, the sacredness of human life. Number two, cultivation of an enabling environment for the flourishing of people living with disabilities. And the third and the last one is empowering people living with disabilities as equal partners in the flourishing of our world. This is what I write in this specific chapter of the book. The doctrine of the image of God affirms the sacredness of all human life. Since all human beings without exception are created in the image of God, the life they have is inherently sacred. The sacredness of a human being does not depend on external confinement. Human beings, those living with disability, no less, Christians and non-Christians, are sacred because they are by nature sacred. Consequently, every human life without exception must be revered. One who honors the sacredness of human life lives differently. He or she protects human life and shuns wanton destruction of human life, desecration of human life, and compromise of human rights. This is how the dignity of all people is defended unconditionally. Now, so if you read Genesis 1:26 to 27, it speaks of our creation in the image of God. Genesis 9:6 talks about or warns against wanton destruction of human life. Whoever sheds blood, his blood shall also be shed, or whoever kills someone, he shall also be killed. And then it gives the reason for in the human of God were all human beings created. Now, so the doctrine of the image of God really talks about or affirms the sacredness of human life. Every life, every human life, all of us are beings that are created in the image of God. Whether we are living with disability or not, and there's a lot of scholarship that talks about that all of us are actually living with a form of disability, and that we need to treat people as sacred beings, because they are created they created in the image of God. Those who might not be familiar with some of these conversations, there's a fantastic book written by David Goshay. It's called The Sacredness of Human Life: Why an Ancient Biblical Vision is Key to the World's Future. And he does a lot of, it's like, that language you see there is actually the language of David B. Goshay as well. The sacredness of human life. And he roots all this conversation on the sacredness of human life on the image of God, that we treat human life with honor and with dignity because people are created in the image and likeness of God. That's very, very important to affirm. And then he says, of course, human beings have that sacred nature. They have sacred nature, not because we confer that on them, but because it is already ingrained in them. It is already in them by virtue of their creation in the image of God. The second thing is that we need to cultivate an enabling environment for people with disabilities to flourish. Well, this one, there's so many things we can say about this. Let me just quickly talk about a few of them. One, we need to overcome the structures, the systems that disables people, that hinders people from flourishing. That is very, very important. And we need to be very intentional about that. And I serve in a church in Nairobi, but I am an associate minister there. And we had to be really intentional about opening our doors, sometimes literally, to people living with disabilities. And we look at the structures, the infrastructure, the architecture, we design the buildings, how we have all these steps or stairs. We need to have ramps. We need to make sure that the bathrooms are accessible, offices are accessible, and so on and so forth. I was talking to a friend of mine who used to serve as a registrar at the public university in Kenya. And I was telling him about this webinar today. And he told me that he served as a registrar, and even though the government of Kenya requires that, we need to make sure that our institutions are disability friendly, they never took that seriously until one day they advertised for a very senior position and shortlisted several candidates, and people showed up for interview, and the best candidate was living with disability. So when they hired that specific candidate, the school had to really quickly act and make sure that some things were done to make sure that this person could actually access his office, and so on and so forth. The offices had to be reorganized and so on and so forth. So churches too, we have to really be very intentional, and we don't have to wait until the last minute. We don't have to wait until we hire a minister who is living with a disability, or we hire somebody on a wheelchair for us to begin designing structures and programs and facilities with people. We need to design those things with people with disabilities in mind. And in fact, it would be better if the people living with disabilities were actually part of that program, designing those things together with them. Let them shape the programs, let them, shape their curriculum, let them shape their services so that they are the one telling us how they want to be served. Confront all the dehumanizing structures and cultures so prevalent in Africa concerning people with disabilities. We need to confront them with a better ethic, a better theology, talk about the value for human life, talk about the need the need for hospitality, talk about the need for welcome, make sure we are able to confront all these systems and values that degrade or cheapen life or waste life. That's very, very important. Finally, we need to empower people with disabilities as equal partners in the flourishing of our world. I've talked about employment. We need to reappraise prevailing notions of productive work and success. This is really critical because I'm thinking about how many people in my country of Kenya, I see beggars on the streets, and majority tend to be either people living with disabilities, sitting by the sidelines, begging, asking for something, for handouts. But it would be more productive. They would be more productive if we were giving them opportunities for employment. And I am saying this, of course, with the recognition that some people living with disabilities might not be able to work. Some might not be able to function. Maybe they are living with some severe mental condition, for example. But then we have so many who can actually contribute to the flourishing of our churches, of our countries. So we need to make sure that we are intentional about providing work opportunities for them. And for that to happen, we need to reappraise the prevailing notions of productivity. What does it mean to be productive? What does it mean for are we able to value the less? Are we able to value their contributions? Are we able to look at their contributions and say, yes, this is excellent contribution as well, even though it might not fit into our language, it might not fit into our definition of productivity. That I think is very, very, very important. All right, I have 2 more slides. So the church, I've talked about the church as a center of formation in the image of God. And though the church is imperfect, the church is an alternative community, or it should be an alternative community. It should be a community of God's people who have encountered the transforming power of the Holy Spirit. And so the church is the physical body of God on earth. But put differently, the church is the image of God on earth. It is the manifestation of what God has done and continues to do on earth. It is the manifestation of a new humanity being formed in the image of God in Christ by the Spirit. And what I'm trying to say is that, well, the church should actually embody an alternative reality. It should treat people differently from the culture, the prevailing culture. It should, it should model for us what actually it means to honor the humanity of people. It's created in the image of God. Let me finish with this fantastic quotation from Disability and the Gospel by Imago Dei. The absence of people with disabilities in the church indicates that the church has not yet grasped deeply enough the essence of the gospel. And conversely, God's people have drunk too much, too deeply from the well of cultural ideology with regard to wholeness and brokenness. If people with disabilities are not welcomed by the church, much less aggressively pursued by the church, it may be because, like the world around us, we would rather think we are on the way to recovery, that we are strong in Christ and healthy. We would rather not be bothered by the care that those who live with brokenness require. We don't wish to be reminded by their very presence how much like them we really are. I thought that was really a very interesting quotation. It didn't make it to my book, but I was reading this specific book right now when I was preparing for this conversation, and I found it very, very interesting. So the church really need to model a different way of life and being able to be a welcoming, not because we are seeing people with disabilities as, candidates for charitable causes or for camera benevolence, or, to show that we are a welcoming church, but because we honor the image of God in them. We honor who they are as human beings. And I think that is a very, very important thing for us to remember. So thank you very much, and may the Lord bless us.
So much, David, for that. Really helpful. We do have time for a couple of questions. So you can either put it in the chat or you can raise your hand and just ask David your question.
David.
Yes, go
Do you hear
ahead.
me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm just trying to organize my camera. Sorry about that. So the question that I have, I had a stroke in '99, and the physio came up to me and she said, unless you keep your fingers malleable and keep doing this to your fingers, eventually you are going to end up with a clenched fist and a club arm. And I was like, no, thanks very much. And so I've done this sort of thing pretty much religiously since then. But on mindfulness and looking deeper within myself, I realized like how many clenched fists and club arms I had in my life. And it was all about like, whenever I saw somebody who was different to me or the other, I immediately clenched up and I immediately started going, I don't know how to relate to this person and I don't know how to engage. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk to somebody who is just like me. And I gave a lady a lift up to Tesco's while I was in the UK, and we pulled into the parking lot, and she said, "What are you doing? There's parking spaces all over this place." And I said, "I've got a little blue badge, and that entitled me to a disabled parking lot." And so she goes, "Oh yes, because you're an invalid." And I said, "I think you might have meant invalid." And she was mortified that she had made such a mistake, but I laughed about it. But I just said to her, there's so many times that I've walked into a room and people have looked at my dodgy arm and my dodgy leg and have like not known how to engage with me, and so they've withdrawn and they've tightened up and they've just chosen to speak to the valid people in the room and not to me. And what I want to know is there's a fine line between being a Christian and being an open Christian, if you know what I'm saying. There's so many times that I've walked into churches and they've prayed for me without even introducing themselves to me, And then when I haven't been healed, or in the physical sense, they've said either you've got a lack of faith or you've got an unconfessed sin, and then they just carry on, and that's deeply hurtful. But I've chosen to I've opened a little company called Open Hands, and basically it's looking at this and realizing that we need to have open hands to everybody, as you said in your presentation, David. Everybody is sacred. Everybody is a sacred being, and I'm just trying to find words in which I can say I want to see people rather than barriers, but I also want to see people rather than labels and like I don't want to be a judgy judgesons. I don't want to be a person who says no, because you're Muslim that means that you're not going to heaven, etc., etc. How do you differentiate, or how do you become more open rather than closed, specifically within the religion sphere?
That's a very important question. I think really we have to always think about the consequences, or at least the being able to critique how we think and how we name, or how we perceive people. Think, for example, and this is one of the reasons why I have a disquiet about language like differently abled, because it tends to put emphasis on the abilities or the inabilities, or instead of saying, for example, people with disabilities, because then the focus is on the people, not on their disabilities or their how we perceive them. One thing that we have always aspired, or at least tried to do with my wife, she loves the deaf, at our church. She learned sign language on YouTube so that she can do discipleship and be able to communicate with people with disabilities. I haven't done that myself, but I have tried to, be close to her and even learn how to sign my name. But also one of the things we do is to be more intentional about, those kind of friendships. It takes a lot of work. It is not easy. There is a restaurant in Nairobi that decided to hire, all the servers, those who work there are deaf. So you go in there and you sign, or you can write, and they will serve you. We have gone to that restaurant several times just to, cultivate friendships and be able to, it's going to take a lot of hard work on our part, but it is something important. I mean, if we truly value the humanity and the sacredness of our brothers and sisters living with disabilities, then we are going to do the hard work. And I think that's what we have tried.
Yeah. We have time for one more question.
Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Greg.
Olushola, am I saying your name right? You can correct me.
That was great. You did a good job with the name, right? Okay, so hello everyone, wherever you are. I don't know if this is a question or a concern or a request. And I want to thank David for that wonderful presentation. And my comments are kind of connected to Greg's experiences with people who have attempted to, in quotes, heal him. Right now, I'm mother to a 23-year-old special needs son who grew up essentially in Nigeria until we came to Canada 4 years ago, 2021, in my search for like I have been determined to give my son a life in spite of his disability, right? And at some point in his earlier years, I realized that my environment back home was not going to give my son the kind of life I wanted for him. And I was determined to, if you like, pay the price. Okay. I was ready to go the whole hog. And that's not something you see very common with African parents who have special needs children. They much more frequently throw their hands up in the air and give up, despondent, hopeless, and then they waste the grace of God. That's my perception. They waste the grace of God in the lives of those amazing children. And first, I want to say that one conversation I think the church should encourage is to redefine healing. In my journey with my son's disability, because of my commitment and determination, I engaged him in a lot of programs that could provide life skills and all that from an early age. And I remember a particular experience I had. My son has cerebral palsy, which affects his speech and hearing, right? And even to get the right diagnosis took a bit of time. It was a bit challenging, but I mean, it was obvious that something was wrong with him because he is the third child out of three. And I observed that his developmental progress was not like the other two children. So I started early to ask questions, make researches. So I remember clearly some years back when I was so fixated on him regaining his speech, right? And so he was attending a speech therapy program at a school. And one time I was having a review with the head of that school, and she asked me a question. I was expressing my disappointment with the program that, oh, my son's been here 2 years and you guys have not added a single word to his vocabulary. And then she paused and took a good look at me and said, Mrs. Adeyinka, why do you want Moyo to speak? And I was shocked. And she said, it is more important to be able to communicate than to speak. And that was like a moment of revelation for me, because up until that point, I equated communication with speaking. But suddenly I realized, oh my goodness, both are not the same. And that brings me back to Greg's experiences. People in the church have come to have a certain opinion of healing. Mm-hmm. Once your experiences do not agree with that perception, it is assumed that you do not have faith or you are not healed. What I have found out in my journey with my son is that God's definition of healing is different. And God's process of engaging with every individual that he's made in his own image is also different. And there are people that we perceive as, oh, they're not healed in our own worldview, who in actual fact, in God's perception, are doing very well. Absolutely. I think that's an important conversation that the church needs to open up. That's why I said, I don't know if it's a question. It's something that we need to talk about. We need to bring out in the open, because then that should change or shape our worldview and perception about people who we refer to as disabled. I would rather say they are actually differently abled. That's the way I now describe my son. Now he's 23. He still has very limited speech. But he's done so well for himself, because I discovered when I stopped to look at him from my own lenses, I found out that he actually already had the giftings of God in his life for him to have a meaningful and thriving life. I found out that he could draw very well, and he actually had a desire to become a visual artist that he could not express. But once the scales, I put it that way, dropped off from my eyes, and I began to see him in a different perspective from that encounter with a woman who said, "Why do you want your son to speak rather than communicate?" And then we began to explore other ways by which he could communicate. And today he's got an app that's customized for him to engage with people. He can type on his tab. He's got voice to text, apps on his phone and all that. So he's able to communicate, although he's not able to speak like you and I. And that's just what I wanted to contribute to this conversation, that the church needs to revisit our perception, our definition, our understanding of healing, so that we can drop the, I'm trying to find the right word, the misconceptions, the myths around healing, because ultimately God is God and we cannot take his place in the lives of anyone.
Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you so much for sharing that. David, do you have a brief response to that, or?
No, I think my response is amen to that. I think we really need to be able to counter some of those theologies or narratives or ways of thinking with a better narrative. And I think you really talked about healing. We need to look at what does it mean to be healed. And I was reading the foreword in this book, and the writer Samuel Kabue talks about, healing, actually. And he says that one of the reasons why many people in Africa are dehumanized is because of this belief that they need to be healed, or actually, worse still, there is a demon that needs to be exorcised or removed from them. And if they don't get healing, the problem is they don't have enough faith. They lack faith. So we need to counter that and be able to talk about what is healing. And I really appreciate your comments. So thank you so much.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thanks a lot, everyone. David, you just have a representative here from Langham to mention briefly about the book.
All right. Yeah, the representative is Liz Mburu. Liz, I see you. If you can take a minute or two. I think I see your other colleague, Stephen Van Dyke. He's from Canada. He serves at Langham as well. But Elizabeth, please go ahead. Liz? Oops, okay. All right. Stephen, if you can go ahead and talk about Langham for a minute. Yeah.
Hey, sure. I don't know what happened to Liz, but Liz is more directly involved with literature.
I'm sorry, I'm here now. My internet dropped.
There you go, Liz. You should take this.
Yes,
I'm
so sorry.
literature than me.
This happens all the time with online. So can I go ahead and just briefly talk about Langham? Just for 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, I hope I'm clear. My internet is really choppy, but thank you, David, for that excellent presentation and for raising awareness. This discussion makes me feel that there needs to be a workshop or something, of a longer duration for us to discuss how to go about doing these things. And perhaps there's another book that might come out of that, David. So that's my challenge to you. So I'm Liz Mburu. I am with Langham Literature. My colleague Nyambura Kamau is also on this call. She's responsible for partner relations. I am the Langham Literature Regional Coordinator for Anglophone Africa, and it was such an honor for us to publish this book with all the various dimensions to it and the various authors. And so all I really want to say, because I know it's been quite a time, I just want to talk about the imprint under which we published disability inclusion. And of course, we also published David's dissertation under one of our imprints, A Different Way of Being, Theological a reformed theology of ethnopolitical cohesion. And so we publish dissertations under Langham Academic imprint. We also have another imprint called Langham Global Library, and still another Langham Preaching Resources. But the imprint under which we publish disability inclusion is Hippo Books. And the vision of Hippo Books is to produce biblically sound, contextually relevant, and quality pastoral and academic resources through African scholarship. And just listening to David, I feel that he has already demonstrated what Hippo Books is about. He began with the contextual piece, talking about the African worldview, and he situated his work in that particular context. And he was then able to bring out a biblical theology of Imago Dei, reframing and expanding Ubuntu through a Christocentric lens. And I think that just demonstrates what it is that we want to do, and then bringing it down to the ground with the ecclesial kind of implications, with the practical implications. So this is what Hippo Books does. We publish mainly African scholars, whether on the continent or in diaspora. But if you are interested in publishing with Langham, you can go on our website, langhamliterature.org, see what we have for you. You can publish in one of the other imprints if you are not African. If you are African and there is a particular topic that you want to pursue, just like David participated in the disability inclusion book, there might be a topic that's on your heart and you really want to pursue that, and you want to engage with the culture, and you want to engage with the biblical context, and you want to make a difference. We believe our books are making a difference in the church. And so I would encourage you. I can put my email in the chat for those who are interested in pursuing more conversations about Langham. If that's okay, Sarah, would that be fine?
Yes,
Yes,
yes, of course.
yes, I recognize we've run out of time, so I don't want to take too long. So thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to speak. And I'll just put my email if anybody is interested. And Nyambura will put hers too if you're interested in having contextual resources from the majority world for your institutions.
Great. Thank you so much.
If I could take 30 seconds just to add to what Elizabeth said. The other part of what Langham does is to provide PhD level scholarship theology students drawn from the majority world. David Tarus is a great example of the kind of candidate who comes to Langham and we support. He did his PhD at McMaster University through Langham Scholars. And so if you're interested in PhD level theological education, then you can talk to Langham.
Thank you. Okay, thanks. I would just like to again say thank you to David for this wonderful time together. Thank you for the time and thought you've put into this, and for what you also put into preparations for the course you teach with us. Really appreciate that. I want to remind everyone that this is just the first in our whole series of webinars. The next one will take place on May 12th with Dr. Goran Zivkovic, who is Serbian, living and teaching currently in Germany. And the topic is to be determined. So keep an eye on your email or wherever you found this from us. We'll be in touch. And you have that to look forward to about a month from now. So thanks a lot, everyone, for coming.